ever attend if you live in Clown County. The reality, we are very, very fortunate that the TAG and Colonel Braun and his team put it a priority that there be what's called deliberative planning. That means it's done before the event, a no-notice event happens, like an earthquake. And so they have been working on this for at least a year. I'll let Colonel Braun explain more about it, but it's a plan and it's set and we have it, and so we'll know what to expect. By knowing what to expect, those of you that are in this room that are our stakeholders and partners in response, we can better plan on our end as local responders first on scene if we know what to expect down the road, and I'll let Colonel Braun explain when that will be and what that will be. So I really appreciate your time. I think that you will walk away from this knowing that you made a good decision to be here this morning, not just for you and your family, but also for the folks that you serve in this county. So, I'll let you go.
Oh my goodness, well, thank you, James. Hey, so good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
My name is Clayton Braun. I am a lieutenant colonel in the Washington National Guard. And my job in the National Guard, I'm the Deputy J3 for the Washington National Guard. I'm also the J35. So J, what that means is that I'm on the joint staff. The joint staff in the Washington National Guard is the staff that focuses on domestic operations, things that happen here in the homeland. As the Deputy J3, 3 stands for operations. So when there's an operation, I'm the guy that gets saddled with the coordination of that event. A couple of recent noticeable events, of course. The SR 530 landslide, you saw a guard mobilized out there. That was my shop mobilizing those folks at the behest of the Adjutant General and by request that initiated the Insect Command level. And we put those forces out to do great things. Again, another big event that we participated in last year, of course, were the wildfires. You saw another about 800 or so guardsmen go out. So that's our job, that's our shop, the J3, if you will. I'm also the J35, so dual-hatted. The J35, the J, the 3 stand for the same things. The 5 stands for planning. So basically, I'm the guy, I'm the Stucky, if you will, who has to do operational planning for the Washington National Guard's domestic operation. So that's the job that the Adjutant General hired me into about 2 years ago. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So I've just introduced myself. Now you all know who I am. So if we could just kind of go around the room, we'll start up in the corner and just get everyone just a couple of sentences. Who you are, what agency do you represent, just to give me an idea of who I'm talking to today. That would be very helpful. And you'll see as we go through the room that I brought some folks with me today, so they'll introduce themselves as well. And so the gentleman who's just now sitting down, he gets to be the first one to speak. So, sir.
Alan Warner, Aviation Coordinator for County Emergency Management. Jeff Barton, Homeland Response Force. I do outreach for them.
Laura Martinez, I'm also part of the Homeland Response Force outreach team.
Lee Schilling, City of Forks Emergency Management Operations. Susan Black, Olympic Medical Center Security and Emergency.
Alex Risk, Peninsula College Campus Safety, and I'm also doing an internship with Jamie.
Bill Beach, County Commissioner, District 3.
Jamie Weiskamp with Clown County Emergency Management under the Sheriff's Office.
Ann Johnson, Community Responder for the Gerke Road area, and we are the 3 and the 5 on our team.
Steve Saunders, I'm with the Homeland Response Force, also with the outreach team, and I'll be assigned to the region.
I'm Robert Reddick. I work at the Joint Operations Center. I work for Colonel Braun, and I do the day-to-day stuff in our shop.
Chief Joel Kaufman with the U.S. Coast Guard Air Station, Port Angeles, Communications Operations.
Steve Romberg, Manager of PENCOM, the 911 Center in Clown County.
Bill Benedict, Clown County Sheriff.
Mark Swanson, Civil Patrol.
Andrew Swanson, Civil Patrol.
Ricky Stenberg, Operations Supervisor.
Mark Nichols, County Prosecutor and Coroner.
Tina Henderson, Manager, Braun County Prosecuting Attorney's Office.
Bill Carter, Clown County, Amateur Radio Emergency Service. Terry Reed, Port Angeles Fire Department.
Ben Andrews, Assistant Chief of Fire District 3 in Squim, and Deputy IC for the Northwest Type 3 Blue Team.
You can say chief.
Well, come on.
Go ahead.
You did well, thanks.
Jen Gerslam, Clallam County Environmental. Jerry Bowen, Department of Corrections, Association of County.
Sterling as a volunteer, Clallam County Sheriff's Office, Incident Management.
Kathleen Ryder, Clallam County Amateur Radio Emergency Services Training Coordinator.
I'm Don Zanone, I'm with the Red Cross Disaster Team.
Christy Curley, I'm with Peninsula Housing Authority. Janice Carpenter, I'm a property manager with Peninsula Housing Authority.
Harlan Rainiac, Information Officer for CERT, Parkwood based.
Mike Hansen, Commander of Emergency Response Team in Parkwood.
Keith Wells, District Court.
Penny Lindemann, Emergency Manager.
I'm Carolyn Flynn. I'm a private citizen. I volunteer, and I'm going to be reporting to the Wanapeto Scenic Byway Association, which is Highway 112, the Crescent Community Advisory Council, which is in the Joyce area, and my own little block watch.
My name is Joe Turry with the Lower Elwha Clallam Tribe Councilman.
I'm Dave Holt, Clallam County Sheriff's Office of Emergency Management Technical Specialist.
I'm Ron Cameron, I'm Sheriff of Long County, Emergency Manager.
Brian Smith, Deputy Chief, Port Angeles Police.
Perfect. Let's go to the three that just walked in so they can find some seats.
From Lakewood. American Red Cross, Michelle Kelly, I'm the Executive Director for One More Day. Serving Jefferson, Clallam, and Kitsap County.
Ann Parsons, Red Cross Disaster Services in Arizona.
And Bill Wheeler, Red Cross volunteer.
Perfect.
Jim Buck, former state representative and specializing on Cascadia effects on the 24th district.
Don Buck, with the Fire District in Joyce, number 4.
Larry Noblin, just private citizen trying to keep up with what's going on.
Jack Regan, I work with the National Guard on readiness reporting.
Terry Gallagher, I'm the police chief in Port Angeles.
Rich Sill, Clallam County HR Risk Management.
Perfect.
Mary Ellen Lindborn, Clallam County Community Development Director.
Perfect. Did we miss anybody?
Just me. I'm Stephanie Noblin. I'm a concerned citizen. This video will be posted at smartawareness.org for anybody who wants to share it with your colleagues.
Okay, thank you. So, thanks very much for letting me understand who the audience is today. Sounds like, for the most part, it's Clallam County, right? So that's fantastic. It's a great cross-section, and this whole briefing will be very informal, really. I've got a lot of information to put out, and I'll kind of be moving through it very quickly. But if you have a question along the way, just get my attention, stop me, and ask the question, right? We're all here to share information. So going back to how I started. So the Adjutant General hired me about 2 years ago into this position. And of course, well, the first thing he told me is, he said, Clay, I'm putting you in this job because I want you to focus on domestic operations. He said, my number one priority, that's what he told me, my number one priority is domestic operations. I said, Roger, boss, got it. He says, in domestic operations, the thing that keeps me awake at night is this thing called the CSZ. So what I want you to do is I want you to find a solution. I want you to fix it. And of course, he's a 2-star general, and I'm not. And I said, Roger, sir. And he left. And I turned around to my new boss, a colonel, and I said, so I just have one big question. He says, what's that? I said, what's a CSZ? Because I had no idea. So that initiated now it's been about 2 years, a 2-year-long effort where I have learned an awful lot. I've had a learning curve that was nearly vertical at times, but I overcame it. And we started figuring out what the CSZ was and trying to figure out how we fix it. So with that, we'll just dive into this. The purpose of the briefing, the reason I'm here today, is to basically gain some support for increased planning effort in support of solving the CSZ. And to provide an overview of the ongoing planning efforts in the state of Washington, particularly right now for the Washington National Guard, but it's also a whole of state, Washington Military Department, Emergency Management, we're all working together to try and figure out the solution. So, overview of the ongoing planning efforts and exercises. All right, so we'll start off, we'll talk about the threat. The CSZ. So for those of you that aren't in the know, and I assume at this point most everybody here is smarter than I was 2 years ago. So the CSZ is the Cascadia Subduction Zone, right? So we have this thing out in the Pacific Ocean, we call it the Ring of Fire. The Pacific Ocean is ringed by places where tectonic plates, huge, the Earth's crust is colliding. These plates create zones where one plate rides over or goes under another. That's called a subduction zone. And those red lines on this map indicate where those subduction zones are around the Pacific Ocean. So they're basically all the way around the ocean. The blue stars indicate where on those collision points, on those subduction zones, there has been a major earthquake in the last 50 years. And I love this slide because people generally realize very quickly that our red line doesn't have a blue star, right? So it tends to get people's attention, although I'll tell you that the scientists will tell you that that's not significant. It's not scientifically significant because these things don't rupture. These subduction zones don't typically rupture on a 50-year cycle. Their cycle is much greater than that. But it does kind of get your attention to realize that we haven't had one, at least recently. So the Ring of Fire, home to the majority of the world's earthquakes and the majority of the world's really big earthquakes. All right, so our red line, the Cascadia Subduction Zone, is a fault line, so an earthquake fault line that's about 800 miles long, runs from northern California all the way up to Vancouver Island, and it's where the Pacific and Juan de Fuca plates are colliding with the North American plate. So it creates this gigantic fault line. A couple things to understand about earthquake fault lines, just rudimentary. The longer and the larger a fault line is, when it ruptures, typically the more energy is released, so the more damaging it is. So ours is pretty long, at nearly 800 miles. About 15 to 20 years ago, scientists largely thought that our fault line was dormant. They thought that it wasn't slipping anymore. There was no pressure there, no threat. But about 15 years ago, some scientists started looking into this, and they determined that wasn't the case at all. They started seeing some geologic anomalies. They started looking into it. And after a lot of deliberate effort, they determined that, in fact, it's alive and well. It's very active, and it's building up a lot of pressure, and it's a big threat. So they started trying to identify what this threat really is. And what they've determined through the use of paleogeology and some other big words is that, in fact, this thing does have a cyclic rupture rate. It means it does rupture periodically. And they've tried to calculate that. And when you talk to different scientists, depending on which scientist you talk to, they'll give you different numbers. They range from 200 years to literally 1,200 years. So anywhere in the middle, any scientist will tell you what they believe that average is. The most interesting document I've read recently says that 75% of the time that this fault line ruptures, it ruptures in a 310 or less year cycle. 75% of the time in the last about 20,000 years, paleogeology going all the way back to the last ice age here, 20,000 years ago, they said 75% of the time, 310 years or less. The other 25% of the time it goes longer than 310 years, and at least twice it's gone all the way up to about 1,200 years. So why is that 75% significant? Well, through paleogeology, they determined that the last rupture of the Cascadia Subduction Zone was on January 26th of the year 1700. Quick math tells you that as of last January, that was about 315 years ago. So we're already past that 75%, and we're slowly ticking down the remaining 25%. So the real takeaway here is that it's not an if this thing happens equation. It's a when this happens equation. It's coming. We know it's coming. We just can't pinpoint exactly when it's coming. All right. The other big thing through paleogeology is they determined, when they looked at this fault line and determined how strong it is, they determine what its average rupture strength is, how much energy on average is released. And the big thing is the bigger the fault line, the more energy. This one's big. So if you look at the Tohoku, Japan, this is a nearly identical scenario. So this one, the average rupture magnitude of this fault line is a magnitude 9 earthquake. Magnitude 9 earthquake, that's the average. The worst case is something worse than that. Some scientists believe it could be as bad as a 9.3. And if you're familiar with these scales, each 10th increase is 100 times more energy released, right? So it's very exponential, and it's very bad, very damaging. So potentially a 9.0, and we're already counting down. All right. So those scientists, when they identified this and they started to figure out what this threat was, they got some help from FEMA, and FEMA eventually, when they had enough data put together, FEMA helped them create a working group called CREW, Cascadia Region Earthquake Work Group, if you've heard of them. In 2005, they published their first white paper that talks about this threat. It was a great white paper. It's available online today. You can look it up. In that white paper, as it laid out the threat, FEMA had assisted CREW to take that and provide it to another Department of Homeland Security agency called HITRAC, the Homeland Infrastructure Threat and Risk Analysis Center. HITRAC took that threat data and basically plugged it into a computer model. It took a few years to do this and some millions of dollars, but they were able to model what this earthquake looks like here when applied to our critical infrastructure and our resources here. And so we call this the HITRAC model, and we want to talk about that a little bit because all the stuff you're going to see in a few minutes is based off of that HITRAC model. But it's a computer model, so it has some limitations. The first thing you have to understand, they had to pick a date-time group for when this thing happened, and that date-time group has significant effect, depending on what time of year the rupture occurs and all that. So they selected February 6th, 9:41 in the morning, a weekday. And all of that is important. February, it's typically it's the rainier season. The landslide potential is greater because the hills are inundated with water. They selected 9:41 in the morning, a weekday. So if you're in an urban area, the morning commute is probably over. It's a weekday, so children are in school. Right? All of that is important. They modeled a complete rupture of the CSZ fault line because that's the threat we fear most. There is an instance where this particular fault line may rupture just on the lower section. That is a significantly lower threat than this. So they modeled a complete rupture. They placed an epicenter on the fault line. And what that really speaks to is the limitation of the modeling software. These earthquakes, you can think of them kind of like a zipper, these fault lines. When they begin to rupture, it'll spread from wherever it starts, it'll spread to the ends of the fault line in both directions. And if you think of that as a zipper, if a metal zipper with the little cogs, each cog kind of becomes its own epicenter. So what does that mean? Well, a normal earthquake typically is 30 or 40 seconds in duration, and then it's over. And then you have to deal with aftershocks. These earthquakes don't do that. These earthquakes will be a continuous rupture and continuous shaking until that zipper has unzipped to both ends of the fault line, which means that the shaking could be 5 to 10 minutes. On this one, actually they say 4 to 10 minutes, and so we average that out and we say 5 minutes, but think what I'm saying here. Magnitude 9 earthquake that's going to shake for 5 minutes, right? If you were around in 2001 when the Nisqually quake happened, that was a 6.8 magnitude earthquake centered under Anderson Island. Shook for about 35 seconds, maybe 40 seconds, and it caused about a little over $2 billion worth of damage. 6.8, 35 seconds. So now we're talking magnitude 9 for 5 minutes, right? Initial estimates exceed $200 billion, right? So just keep that in mind. All right, magnitude 9 earthquake with ground shaking up to 5 minutes. So I just explained the 5 minutes. The magnitude 9, the paleogeologists have determined that magnitude 9 is the average full rupture of this earthquake, not the worst case. Worst case could be up to 9.3. Tsunami wave heights of 20 to 80 feet. So when HITRAC did this analysis, They didn't have a lot of tsunami data to go back and use in their modeling. Washington DNR had, over the years, done some tsunami, and so they used some of that data and other data they had available. Bottom line is, there's not a lot of confidence in this number right here for the tsunamis. So that crew work group's actually back together right now. They're doing a study for the tsunami modeling, and they're doing it. They started on the Washington and Southwest Washington coast, and it's going to take them several years to do all of the modeling, but they're redoing it right now. I think that they've already published the Southwest coast, and now they're up to about Grace Harbor area and in there. So they're remodeling it. And initially, what they're finding is certainly that the tsunami wave heights and the tsunami damage is worse than the high-trek study had imagined. So that's bad news too. So more to follow on that as it becomes publishable. Aftershocks. These earthquakes suffer thousands of aftershocks that will occur for years after the main rupture. Tohoku, Japan, had, I think, 4 aftershocks the day of the rupture that exceeded 7.5 magnitude. And if I'm not mistaken, they're still having aftershocks now, right, periodically. So aftershocks are a certainty, and they will be bad. If there's an aftershock that has a magnitude of 7.0 or 7.5 or greater, it has the potential of generating additional tsunamis. So there could be additional tsunamis. Now, this is all part of the modeling data for high-track. But a couple limitations, or a couple other limitations with high-track. Number one is their modeling stopped at the crest of the Cascade Mountains. So there is absolutely zero modeling for effects east of the Cascades, which is a problem. We know that there will be effect. We anticipate it will be much less than in western Washington, but we can't really quantify what it's going to look like. Some other problems with the high-track study is that it could only model the primary effect of the shaking and the primary effect of the tsunami modeling they had to use. It cannot model, could not model any of the secondary effects. So aftershocks are not modeled. Fires. These earthquakes are always, always, always accompanied by massive fires. They couldn't model any of that. Dehydration, disease, any of that, none of it's modeled. So just remember, as I show you all these upcoming slides, that's just the first shake and the first wave. That's all it is. All right, so these earthquakes have 4 major components that we're concerned with. The first one, of course, is the intensity of the shaking. In the United States, we measure that with the Mercalli index. What this slide shows you in a very generalized way is that the closer you are to the fault line, the more intense the shaking. That magnitude 9 earthquake, that magnitude 9 occurs at the fault line. The farther you get away from the fault line, of course, the less intense the shaking. The duration is the same. You still get all 5 minutes, but the intensity is decreased. In this case, however, Seattle is still something above a magnitude 7. Still above a magnitude 7. So again, go back to Nisqually, 6.8, 5 minutes, or 40 seconds. Now you got something greater than magnitude 7. So that's the Mercalli index. The next piece that we get concerned with is liquefaction. So liquefaction, by definition, is where the water content in the soil is such that when the soil is shaken vigorously, it loses its ability to bear weight. What that means is that if you have a building that's built in a liquefactable area, the foundation loses the ability to bear the weight of the building. You can think of it in layman's terms as quicksand. That's kind of quicksand. Whenever you see photographic evidence of an earthquake, usually the photographs that are the most crazy, the ones that really get your attention, are photographs of liquefactable areas. When you see a building that has literally fallen over on its side, that's because it was in a liquefactable area. When you see a car that is completely submerged in the middle of the street and the street is re-solidified, that's because that street was in a liquefactable area. It liquefied, the car sunk, and then it re-solidified. Any other question?
So what's the general geographic area of that yellow blob in Clayton County?
This one?
Yeah.
For liquefaction?
Right.
Well, I think that right there is about, I think that's Swim.
That'd be in Swim Valley.
Dungeness Harbor.
Say again?
Be the Dungeness Valley.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
All right, so that's liquefaction. Generally, the photographic evidence is the most engaging, if you will. The next thing we're concerned about here are landslides. And again, let's go back to the SR 530 landslide. So that occurred March 22nd of last year. Rainy season, hills were pretty much inundated. 1 square mile of dirt severed one state route, wiped out the community there at Steelhead Drive, killed 43 people, semi-isolated the town of Darrington. And I say semi-isolated because you could still get to Darrington, it just required a 2-hour detour. It was a pretty big deal, right? 1 square mile of dirt. With virtually unlimited resources, it took us 6 weeks to get 1 lane of State Route 530 reopened. Right? And with those same virtually unlimited resources, it took us 6 months to get State Route 530 reestablished. Right? 6 months. That was 1 landslide, virtually unlimited resources. When the Cascadia ruptures, we will experience at least dozens, if not hundreds, of similar landslides throughout western Washington. So big deal. Tsunami, last but definitely not least, tsunamis. So typically, with earthquakes of this magnitude, the tsunamis are the greatest killers. They're the ones that take the most lives. So here's an example I like to give for the tsunami, and in general for the comparing this earthquake. Tohoku, Japan, March 2011. Japan is arguably the most prepared nation on this planet when it comes to preparedness for seismic events, right? Arguably the most prepared nation on the planet for massive earthquakes. Their harbors, many of their harbors even have tsunami barriers built in front of their harbors. We haven't even begun to think of doing that here. Tsunami barriers. Tohoku, Japan, Sendai, you saw the tsunami jumping over the tsunami barrier and wiping out the port there and the town, the parts of the town of Sendai. Their only miscalculation was they didn't realize how much energy that fault line was going to release. You know, if they realized it was going to be a full-on magnitude 9, they would have built their barrier larger. But they didn't build it large enough, and so we saw the devastation. We, of course, don't have any tsunami barriers. Even though Japan had gone to that level of preparation, they still lost 16,000 people in that event. Right? Most prepared nation on the planet. Here in the state of Washington today, we have about 50,000 people that live in tsunami areas, tsunami-prone areas. Right? 50,000. Big number. All right, just a blow up here of the ground shaking. Here's some photographic evidence of aftermath of the heavy shaking. And for those of you that are familiar with Christchurch, New Zealand, their earthquake, this is a great indicator of what we could expect. So this building is obviously no longer stable, right? The underlying floor there is no longer stable. But the building hasn't completely fallen yet. In Christchurch, New Zealand, the majority of the deaths didn't occur with the primary earthquake. The majority of the loss of life in Christchurch was from the aftershock, right? The aftershock. So imagine one good aftershock on that structure. That building's probably coming down. All right, here's some photographic evidence of liquefaction. Here's that building lying on its side. Here's the car submerged in the middle of the street. This is a sewer vent. That used to be at grade, but when the soil becomes liquefactable, that long concrete tube filled with air actually lifts up, right? It floats to the surface, so it's no longer at grade. And then out here you've got these geysers that formed in a field because of the fissures out there and liquefactable. Tsunami inundation areas in the state of Washington. There are some here. We have a Coast Guard guy in the room. I feel for you. Here's that tsunami barrier. Okay. And how a ship of that size gets to rest on top of the roof of a 2-story building is something that's hard to imagine. All right, so here's a legend, and I want you to learn this very quickly because it's going to come into play on all of the slides I'm about to show you here in a minute. But out of that high-track study, the critical infrastructure and key resources are color-coded as to the damage that they are likely to receive or could potentially receive after this earthquake. So this burgundy or brown, in the high-track study, it's labeled as completely destroyed or complete destruction. That means that it is no longer existing. If it's a building, it's gone. Severely damaged for red, not usable. If it's amber, it means it's moderately damaged. For our planning team, we calculated that as 50% usable, just so we have a number to calculate against. If it's green, that means it's slightly damaged, which means that it's got some visible damage, but it's still 100% usable. And then gray means no damage at all. This is a good time to talk about the high-track study again, being representative but not predictive, right? This data, it's called a Monte Carlo simulation. They put it into a computer, they run it, they record the results, they run it again, they re-record the results. They do that multiple times. They kind of average out the results to see what it looks like. So although the data is defined enough to go in and look at a specific, let's say, firehouse, and get the indication that that firehouse, according to the study, is going to fail, well, that's representative. It's not predictive. So let's say that you had 10 firehouses in your jurisdiction, and it says that 7 of them are going to fail and 3 of them aren't. What would be terrible to do is to go and bolster those 7 and make them earthquake prone, but not do anything with the other 3, right? So what I ask you to do is look at this data as representative, not predictive. If it says that you're going to have 7 out of 10 fail, then assume that every firehouse has a 70% chance of failing, right? Does that make sense? Representative, not predictive. All right, at the time of the study, and you have to realize now the study was published about 3 years ago. It took them about 3 years to do the study. So this data at its very newest is probably close to 6 years old, right? So if an emergency ops center isn't in the same location that you believe it to be, again, representative, not predictive, right? But at the time of the study, there were 48 emergency operations centers in Western Washington. Of those 48 emergency operations centers, 37% would have to devolve their authority to someone else, somewhere else, meaning that the facility and the people are not available, right? The devolution of authority. So 37% would have to devolve. Pretty tough to run an emergency response if all of your coordinators had to devolve their authority to people that aren't even in the know, right? So pretty tough. Communications facilities. So here we're talking about broadcast television, broadcast radio, cellular towers. And so at the time, of course, there's been some improvements with some of the cell towers now. Some of them got backup power, some of them have solar power. But no matter what, you're starting to see a trend here. If you start at the coast and work your way east, you'll notice that there's a lot of burgundy to red to amber to green to gray. And you're going to see that on a lot of these subsequent slides. The bottom line is, it's going to be pretty tough to communicate in this environment. And this environment is only talking about the cell towers, whether they're still standing or whether they've fallen down. It's not talking about their ability to receive fuel if they have backup power generation, or to receive grid power if they're powered that way. But it's not talking about any of that, or falling out of alignment for an antenna system if it's been shaken out of alignment. They're not talking about its usability. They're only talking about its structural existence. Pretty tough to communicate in this environment. Hospitals. At the time of the study, there were about 112 hospitals in Western Washington. Now, the takeaway here is this one right here. The total reduction in hospital capacity is about 45%. Now, just like the last statement, we're not talking about the hospital's ability to handle patients. We're not talking about that capacity. We're talking structural capacity of the hospitals. Remember that in this environment at this point in time, your power is gone. Your water is no longer running. You don't have sanitation. Your road network doesn't support movement in a lot of places. So we're only talking the structural capacity of the hospitals, not their ability to handle patients. So a reduction here of 45% is pretty significant. The number associated with that in the FEMA plan, and FEMA, if I haven't already mentioned this, FEMA published their plan in December of 13. And for all the folks here in Public Works, you can get your hands on that plan and see what the federal plan is. We based a lot of our planning off that, and we partnered with those planners. But the bottom line is the FEMA plan talks about that reduction in capacity, and it estimates a medical evacuation requirement from that reduction in capacity. And it's about 15,000 people that have to be medically evacuated in Western Washington just because of the reduction in hospital capacity, not beginning to help any of the newly injured, right? So over 15,000 every day. Again, looking at that trend, right? The farther west you go, the less you have. And there's effectively no remaining hospital capability west of I-5. Senior living facilities. So this conversation is very much like the hospital conversation, except that senior living facilities are not built to the same size of codes as hospitals. So they tend to be less survivable. Also, because seniors tend to like to have a good view, they tend to be located on the top of a hill or near water. And in this scenario, both of those are bad equations, right? So according to the FEMA plan in Western Washington, virtually 100% of the senior living facilities become unusable. That also adds to your medical evacuation requirement. In the FEMA plan, the number here is an increase of 65,000 people in the state of Washington for medical evacuation. If you know anything about the nation's medical evacuation capability, 15,500 from the hospitals, another 65,000 here, and you're at 80,000 medical evacuees from the state of Washington. That far exceeds the nation's capability to provide medical evacuation. We can't get there from here. And this is just Washington. You throw Oregon on this, it's another 60,000. So simply can't get there from here. If you're in the medical network job, if your job is somewhere in there, you realize pretty quickly we have to figure out a non-standard way to conduct some medical evacuation. All right, fire stations. At the time of the study, 971 fire stations in Western Washington. Total reduction is about 1/3 of your fire response capability. About 1/3. Now there's a couple big problems in there. Number one, the road networks in a lot of places don't support movement. So even if a fire engine is available, it may not be able to get where it needs to go, number one. Number two, these earthquakes are always, always, always accompanied by massive fires. Massive fires, right? So at your highest point of need, you've got your lowest percent of availability. Big problems here. Police stations, law enforcement, a lot like the fire discussion. Although the fire discussion, if a firehouse fails, the assumption is that the fire engine was inside and now the fire engine is no longer available. With the law enforcement capability, if a police station fails, the cruiser probably wasn't inside, so your policemen, your cruisers are probably still out on the streets. But the streets are not very passable in a lot of areas, and a lot of your police stations house your dispatch capability. If you lose the ability to dispatch your cruisers, you can't get them where they need to be, right? So problems here too. The total reduction in law enforcement capability is assumed to be about 51%, half. And again, just like the fire, when you get west of Shelton, there's nothing left. You're looking out here, in the fire capacity, there's nothing left out there. And a lot of the ones that show as amber are actually volunteer fire stations. So the fire station may survive, the vehicle may be there, but are the firemen going there or are they going home? I mean, where are they going? So challenges in this position. Correctional facilities. Another big hit here. And some specific problems. This population it's assumed to have a higher resource requirement than the general population, right? Because they have to be secured. They're wards of the state, so they have to be fed and watered and sheltered and all of that, probably to a higher standard than most of the citizens. So it's a higher resource draw. Creates issue. Schools. All right. So these schools, the ones that are actually shown here, aren't all of the schools. These are only the schools that were participants to the national sheltering system. But that, again, creates a whole other problem when we start looking at this. First off, remember, 9:41 in the morning, a weekday. So children are in school, parents are at work. So once this happens, you've already incurred a massive requirement to reunify children with their families in an environment that's going to make that very, very difficult to do. Until those children can be reunified with their families, then we have to shelter them. We have to secure them, potentially feed and water them, provide medical aid. And when you start looking at the school, you see that, there's an awful lot of destruction out there, particularly west of Shelton. So if these are the buildings designated as part of the national sheltering system and they fail, now where do you shelter, right? So now you start looking for nations that come out of this. All right, transportation, sea, air, and rail. There's a lot of, this stuff's all piled in here. It's kind of hard to read this slide because it's taken from a state level view. So I'll just sum it up. The ports are destroyed. Your rail lines coming across the Cascades or coming north or south through the area are destroyed. There's no traffic making it through mountain passes. They're sealed. So that's all bad. You see your air and your rail. The only good news in here is on the air, although almost all the airports have significant infrastructure damage, there's another icon that rests underneath those, a little dot that talks about the runway at a given airport. And the only good news on this slide is that at several of these airports, the runway is actually forecast to survive. The infrastructure may not, but the runway survives. That's the only good news. Here's kind of a closer up of the airports and the runways. All right, the highways. So Skagit River Bridge, right? National highway system. We saw one bridge fail, and we saw an ensuing backup that clogged up 2 counties, right? That was one section of I-5. So what you're not seeing here, because it's the high-level view, is that there are small breaks all through the metropolitan area. And then, of course, wherever there's red, it doesn't mean that the road is gone. It just means that it's broken in so many places it's completely impassable. The thing that first jumps out at you when you look at this slide is that there are no surviving ground routes to the coast, or for that matter, the upper peninsula in the state of Washington. No surviving ground routes whatsoever. Now that's just the roads. When you throw on top of that the bridges, you've got a little bit of a problem. There are nearly 7,000 bridges in the state of Washington. About 60% of those are in western Washington. Of that 60%, about half are forecast to suffer significant structural damage. Now, I don't know where you all came from to be here today, but something that, and I hate to use the word enjoy, but something I do now down in the Tacoma area is I'll count the bridges, the overpasses, the underpasses that I have to traverse when I go somewhere. And the number is staggering. It's staggering. And if you just apply percentages to what you pass, if you're going through 20 and you apply percentages, you say, okay, well, 50% of what I just passed, how do you get anywhere? It's hard, it'll be hard to get anywhere. All right, utilities. All right, so a lot of folks don't realize how Western Washington gets its utilities. The bottom line is that the vast majority of our electrical capability comes to us from east of the Cascades, over the mountain passes. Those electrical lines are forecast to be severed. There will be a power outage. The power outage won't just be Western Washington. The power outage will be the entire western seaboard of the United States. From the Pacific Ocean on the northern border, it will extend all the way back into eastern Montana. And from the Pacific Ocean on the southern border, it will extend all the way back into New Mexico. Now that power won't stay out indefinitely. In fact, most of the power outages will be caused by tripped relays and preventing power surges, that kind of thing. So it'll start to come back fairly quickly. And probably by the end of the first week, there will be power back into eastern Washington. But getting the power to cross the Cascades, grid power, back into western Washington is an effort that could take months, months before grid power comes back into western Washington. Trying to get grid power back out to the coast of Washington is probably a years-long effort. Right? Years-long effort. Long time. That all by itself is a huge problem in response because some of our huge response assets or recovery assets require grid power. They can't make do with a big backup generator. Things like our refineries, our ports, those big cranes, they don't operate on backup power. They need grid power. So trying to get those things re-operational is going to be a problem. All right, so that's the electrical. A lot of folks also, and I think this community is probably more in tune than most, but there are a series of pipelines that transit the entire state of Washington from north to south on the western side. And they provide petroleum and propane and what's the third one? Natural gas. I always forget that. So those three major pipelines. Those pipelines are forecast to be ruptured in dozens of places. Dozens of places, right? So the first thing you think of is, wow, if you rupture those pipelines in dozens of places, there will be massive fire. We already know that there will be massive fires. And that's bad, but it may not be the worst part of that. The worst part of that may be the fact that there will be no fuel in Western Washington for potentially, at least through those pipelines, potentially for more than a year, or maybe multiple years. The repair process for those pipelines is going to take a while. So, big problem in response. No fuel. All right. This slide right here is cut straight out of the FEMA plan, and it's kind of a wrap-up of some of the damage. And so a few things I like to point out here, starting at the bottom right here. Nursing home patient evacuation requirements, 65,000. Hospital patient evacuations, 15,500. 80,000 medical evacuees, and that still does not begin to help any of the newly injured from this earthquake or tsunami, right? So it does not include any of the newly injured. Deaths and injuries, 8,400 dead, 12,000 injured. So if you think, wow, that seems kind of low, remember, this is just the first shake and the first wave, right? None of the secondary effects, none of the fires, none of the aftershocks, no dehydration, no famine, no disease, none of that. So if you think those numbers are kind of low, I think you're probably right. I think they're probably really low. All right, mass feeding and hydration requirements for people. I'd like to talk about that number for just a moment. So I already mentioned earlier that our planning team, we formed this planning team at the behest of the TAG, and we started off kind of small, a bunch of folks from the National Guard. We realized very quickly that this problem exceeded our capability, so we started reaching out to anyone that we could partner with at all. First folks that we reached out to, of course, were FEMA, because they'd written the federal plan, and then, of course, Big Army, Northcom, National Guard Bureau, and it went on and on from there. Of course, we partnered at the hip with Emergency Management Division and state agencies and local jurisdictions. We just keep partnering and getting bigger and bigger. But early on, when we partnered with FEMA, and they wrote the federal plan, they wrote much of the data we're looking at, started finding things like this number, mass feeding and hydration requirements for people. And so we go back to the FEMA planners, and one of the FEMA planners is a nice gal, good friend of mine now, and sweetest gal you'd ever think to meet, really. I mean, the nicest gal ever. But when you start talking to her about this stuff, she can kind of become, you know, a lady of doom. If you think that I'm making this bad, if you had her, you'd be crying already if she was giving this brief. So I asked her about this number, 1.275 million, and I basically said, look, we need to understand how you got to that number. We're trying to kind of deconstruct the planning effort so we understand it better. How did you get to that number? And her response was, well, to tell you the truth, we made it up. So that's okay. You guys did yeoman's labor here. You did a lot of work. It's okay that you had to make that up. But we're the military, and we're very precise about some things, so we need to understand what goes into making that number, and we're going to recalculate it and make it correct. Right? We're going to make it as accurate as possible. And she said, no, Clay, you've got it wrong. We already did that. We have the real number. But the real number is too scary. So this is the number that we use. So, okay, well, I'm a big guy, you know, I'm all grown up, so help me understand the real number then, if that's not the real number. And she says, okay, well, let me put you in the environment. It's earthquake -1. It's the day before the earthquake, and you're in Washington State, and you've got levels of preparedness that differ among the population. You've got maybe a small percentage of the population that is very prepared for this, right? They've got weeks worth of survival food and water, and they are prepared. They will be okay. But it's a very small portion of the population, right? And what comes to mind, of course, initially is probably some of the Mormon faith. They tend to prepare for that. Good for them. Very small portion of the population. Then you've got a much larger portion of the population that's kind of living, you know, a normal paycheck to paycheck type of existence. They've got the cupboards, they've got maybe 3-4 days supply in the cupboards. They'll be able to get some water. They'll be okay for 4 or 5 days, right, before they really start to need any help. And then you've got another segment of the population that is completely unprepared, and at the very second 5 minutes of shaking is stopped, they're going to need help, right? So that's kind of your cross section. So that's the day before the earthquake. On day 3, or immediately after the earthquake, that's what you're left with. That's where you are. There's no more preparing at that point. And so you're okay on day 3. You've got some people you're trying to help. But now let's fast forward, looking at this environment, looking at the inability to move around, and the fact that the ports are down, the roads are down. Fast forward to day 7 or day 10 in this environment, right? The folks that had 3 or 4 days rations, they've been burning through their survival rations. They're running out of everything. The other folks out there, they've needed help already. You got a very, very small piece of the population that they're still doing okay. But by day 7 to 10, your mass feeding and hydration, that requirement, has largely become the population of Western Washington, right? By day 7 or 10. And the population of Western Washington is about 5.3 million people. I said, wow, you're right, that's a scary number. Let's stick with 1.275 million. So just something I like to point out. All right, historical comparisons. So our last one here, year 1700. Very interesting. If any of you are interested in figuring that one out, there's books you can read on it. But the bottom line is it was before recorded history here. So they had to figure that one out by looking at recorded history in Japan, and then looking at some of the scientists here along the coast of Washington identifying that there had been a quake. It's an interesting story how they actually discovered that. It's a good read if you have the time for it. Of course, 1960, the Chilean earthquake. 1964, Alaska. 2004, Sumatra. 230,000 people killed by that tsunami. Almost 250,000 people killed in Sumatra. Right. 2011, Tohoku, Japan. 16,000. Right. All right. So that's the scary part of the brief. That's the threat. From here forward, the unicorns begin to come out, the butterflies. It starts to get much better. Much better. All right. All right. So first off, the TAG put us together, had us do this planning team, and by the time that we started making our way through that threat data and figuring it out, we realized we need help. This is beyond the scope of what we could do as our little planning team. We just didn't have that level of knowledge. So we went back to the Adjutant General and said, boss, we need more guidance. Can you help us understand what you want us to do here? And so he helped us understand his 3 major concerns. And I want to be very careful how I word this. I'm not saying priorities. I'm saying major concerns, right? So his first major concern is to the population that receives the brunt of the impact from this event. So out here on the coast, they're closest to the fault line. They receive the majority of that 9.0 shake. They get the full brunt of the earthquake. And then somewhere between 15 minutes and 30 minutes after that shaking stops, they get hit with a massive tsunami, right? So these people feel the majority of this event. And he says, whatever we do, we have got to get there and render assistance. We've got to do something, and we've got to get there on the very same day if at all possible. We've got to get out there. That's my very first big concern. So Roger, got it. He says, my second big concern is this massive population in the metropolitan area. That portion of the population of the state of Washington is probably less resilient than some of the other populations. They live in a major metropolitan area. Their lines of communication they absolutely rely on their ability to move around in that environment. And after this, they may not be able to move around. So big concern is trying to get in there and help the civil authority to reestablish what we call lines of communication. Think roads, right? The ability to move. So we've got to be trying to help them. And then my third big concern, and again, not a priority, are the folks that are in more rural areas. They tend to have more of the unreinforced masonry construction. probably a little bit more resilient than other portions of the population of the state of Washington, but they're going to need help too. So we've got to figure out how we provide assistance to that segment of the population as well. So, okay, I got a better understanding. So we took that and we began to run with it. So, yes, ma'am.
What was SAR?
Search and rescue.
Thank you.
All right, so our planning team realized pretty quickly that it was over our heads, so we started reaching out to other agencies. And the bigger Army and the bigger Air Force out there around the United States has got a lot more capability than the Washington National Guard does. So you'll hear this plan. We talk about this. I don't know, depending how you build this, the Guard plan. A lot of folks say it's the Guard plan. Come see the Guard plan. And that's because we kind of started this planning group. But the Guard plan is really not a good descriptor for what we're talking about here. Because your Guard, the National Guard in the state of Washington, there's 8,000 of us, Army and Air. Pretty big force. But in this event, a lot of us are victims too, right? We live here. We're part of this community. And we recognize that. We're not superhuman. We can't bear the weight of this event. So what we have to do is coordinate for a larger response nationwide to help us. That's what we're kind of doing here. So the Guard plan, not a good name for this plan. It's easy to say, it rolls off the tongue pretty quickly, but if we were going to be accurate in the title of this plan, it'd be something more like this, right? So it's the Washington Military Department's coordination of DoD assets under the dual status commander concept in order to provide support and sustainment to federal and state ESF actions. Now, the problem with that as the name for a plan is that I don't know what that acronym would spell, but it's not very user-friendly, right? So we just call this the Guard plan. Just realize it's a lot more than just your Guard. All right, so what is this plan not? What are some of the things that this plan won't do? Well, first off is I'm a military guy. Our base planning team, we're primarily military folks, so we can plan pretty well for military stuff. We cannot begin to plan for the civilian assets or civil authority, right? That's not our job. We don't have the authority, and we certainly don't have the know-how. So we have done the DoD plan. And the DoD response is not the total response. The DoD response is an enabler, right? We help civil authority. Every disaster starts locally, right? So it's up to civil authority. So the state and federal ESFs and local authority have to solve the majority of these problems. What we're here to do is to augment you and to help you do that. All right, so how are we going to do that? Well, we've identified first there's two enduring missions that DoD is really, really good at that we can provide here. After this event, as we just saw in all those previous slides, it's really tough to get here. You can't get here, right? And if you can't get here, you can't do much here. Well, DoD can get here. That's something that DoD can do. So we can provide that distribution of personnel, commodities, and equipment. We can get stuff here. That's number one enduring mission DoD can provide. Number two, sustainment, right? If you can't bring stuff in here to sustain your responders, then your responders aren't going to do much good. Well, we're really, really good at installing little remote base camps all over the place in hostile countries and keeping them going, keeping them sustained. We can do that. And that's effectively what we can do here in this disaster environment, is we can install a base camp and sustain it so that the responders operating from there can do their jobs, right? So those are two big enduring missions. And then there's a whole bunch of other capability DoD is good at, and so we can provide all of that in support of civil authority. And there'll be a lot more talking about that in just a few minutes. All right, so our planning team, when we looked at this, if you've ever been part of a military planning effort, we get very, very deep into the weeds about identifying all the necessary facts and assumptions, pages and pages. I'm not going to show you, I'm going to show you 2 pages, and I'm going to get through them very quickly. So the first one right here, what we learned early on is that everybody, all the civil authority knows that when this happens, there's going to be a lot of assets that rush in to help, right? We've seen that at every major event in the United States. You know, Hurricane Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, every one of these, lots of outside stuff rushes in to help. What we learned when we started talking to local authority and civil authority here is that nobody has a plan to receive that and to base it, to house it, sustain it, keep it alive. So that became a problem. That's a fact, because no one really had a plan for that. We've already talked to medical evacuation exceeding our capability. That's a fact. All right, so some of the assumptions we had to make. The first one there, CSZ effects, all per the high-trek study. So what that's talking about is we've been partnering with everybody to do this planning. And what we're trying to get everyone to do, because if you talk to 3 different scientists about the threat here with the CSZ, so what we've done is we said, hey, we're all using the same data. We're going to plan for the high-trek analysis. And if the earthquake is worse, well, at least we'll have a starting point. If the earthquake is better, well, then at least we'll be able to turn some stuff off. But we're all planning for the high-trek study. So that's our number one assumption, is that we're all planning for the high-trek study and FEMA analysis. Second assumption, Region 10 states receive immediate presidential major disaster declarations. So what that really means to us is that federal assets are immediately available, right? Federal assets are immediately available. Now, interesting to note about that assumption is that that's not our planning team making the assumption. That assumption is actually out of the federal plan published by FEMA, right? So that's FEMA's assumption, and they're coordinating to make it a reality. So we only adopt it. The next one here, a CSZ event becomes the DoD main effort. So what does that mean? Well, if we're going to take it to the extreme, what it would mean is if the United States of America was engaged in a land war in China, for example, and there was 5 minutes of shaking on the west coast of the United States, that this becomes the main effort for DoD for at least a period of time. Probably wouldn't stay there indefinitely, right? You got other things to get to. So that's the assumption. What that does is it allows us to look across the entire DoD enterprise for resources and figure out what we can bring in. Now, just like the previous one, that's not our assumption. That's the Northcom assumption, that 4-star headquarters in Colorado that works for the SecDef and the president. They're the ones that made that assumption. We just adopted. All right, next one. The Washington National Guard will not be a lead agency. We'll always be in support. And that is so close to being a fact, it's not funny. The bottom line is we don't want to be in charge, right? We want to support local authority. Local authority has to own this. And we're here to help, and that's always our position. That's our. You saw that in SR 530. You saw it in the wildfires. We always want to be in support of civil authority. Here we talk about state staging areas, guard management. We'll talk more about that in a bit. The current logistics flow. If you look at the federal plan, it's pretty challenging, and there's no surprise to that. If you start thinking about the magnitude of this response, it is a massive logistics event, trying to sustain that population and that response. So the modeling for that, the planning for that is a little bit unhinged right now, but we're trying to make it better. We just had a logistics planning event with FEMA, Northcom, all the big players, so we're improving that daily. And last, on this slide but not least, we'll talk here a little bit about space. Whenever we start talking about using space in the response, we need to coordinate that through MOAs or MOUs. And whenever possible, we can do that before the earthquake. So there'll be some discussion about that. All right. The top 2/3 of this is really all one big assumption. I touched on it earlier. Your National Guard, 8,000 of us here in the state of Washington, we're going to be victims too. We had to try and figure out how we calculate that. How much of our strength do we think we can muster right after the earthquake? And so we took a look and we made some initial cuts, and we said, okay, if it's a Western Washington asset, we're going to say that first 7 to 10 days, the maximum will be 50% response if it's Western Washington. Eastern Washington, a little bit better, about 80, 85%. And then we took that number and we had to look at it closer and say, okay, well, what if they're, a lot of our folks in the civilian world, they wear other uniforms. They might be law enforcers, or they might be firefighters, or they might be hospital employees or some medical profession. We said, okay, if you have any of those jobs, that job is probably more important after this event. You probably need to just stay there. So, and then we also included in that senior living facility, inpatient employees, and utility employees, right, public utilities. If you do any of those things, go do that first. If you can get out of that and come help us, great, but that's primary. That took us down another 20%. So Western Washington now we're saying first 7 to 10 days, the maximum we can expect is 40% strength. Right? It's a pretty big hit to our capability. These last two bullets are both significant. The first one there is that we realized normally when the Guard mobilizes, there's a disaster, and then there's a request to the governor, and the governor issues a proclamation and tells us to mobilize and go do something. Well, all of that requires communications with the governor, takes time. So in this environment, communications are going to be a challenge. It might take us a little while to find key individuals like the governor. So what we would like is a plan that we can execute based on 5 minutes of shaking. We need pre-approval to execute this plan. So to do that, we had to brief the governor, we had to brief his immediate cabinet and his extended cabinet. And we've done that now. We've given the governor a couple of good briefings on this specifically, and he has approved our planning so that we can execute after 5 minutes of shaking, or thereabouts, right? If we believe that it's a massive disaster, we have the ability to execute and self-mobilize. So that's outstanding, we've done that. The next piece of this is that for the parts of the state of Washington that live near federal military installations, federal military installation commanders or commanders on a federal military installation have the ability to render assistance to civil authority. But there's a sticking point. They have to receive a request. If they're not requested, then technically they can't respond, generally. There's caveats there. So what we did in this plan is we went to the governor and we said, hey, we would like to know, Governor, if there's 5 minutes of shaking, do you want those Title 10, those active component entities, to render aid? He said, absolutely. So effectively, our plan is a request from civil authority to those commanders on a Title 10 status to render assistance to civil authority. Now, there's more planning that has to go into that, right? The intent would be that civil authority near a Title 10 installation is coordinating with that installation to give them priorities, things they would like them to work on. But there are also some drawbacks to that. They live here too. They're going to be victims too. And they're going to have things they have to tend to inside their borders before they can look outside their borders. So we'll never really know until the earth shakes for 5 minutes how much help they can assist us with or the rest of us with. But we want them to know that they're being requested. Okay? Please help if you can. All right. Coordinating entities. This slide, I stopped updating this slide about 6 months ago because I ran out of room. But this is just a partial list of the folks that we've been coordinating with in the development of this plan. All right, operational concepts. So the FEMA plan. The FEMA plan breaks down this entire response into 3 phases. Phase 1 is everything that happens before the earthquake. So today, right now, we are in phase 1. We are preparing for this thing. You are here right now gathering information to help you prepare for this earthquake. As soon as the earth shakes for 5 minutes and the CSZ ruptures, then we're thrust into phase 2. Phase 2, quite simply, is the response, right? It's the response. Now, phase 2 is broken down into 3 subphases. Phase 2 alpha is the initial response. You can think of that timeline as extreme chaos, right? Everybody in the affected zone has the same primary goal in phase 2 alpha. And quite simply, it's survive, right? Stay alive. That's your primary goal in phase 2 alpha. Your secondary goal in phase 2 alpha, as soon as you have the capability, is save somebody else, right? Help somebody else. So that's phase 2 alpha. If you're part of an organization that has a response plan in phase 2 alpha, then you're trying to initiate your plan, right? Try to initiate that plan. Now, FEMA's plan, immediately after the earthquake, is to launch the first federal IMAT, Incident Management Assistance Team. That IMAT launches from somewhere else in the country, and it gets here by hook or by crook, with its primary goal is to link up with the State Emergency Operations Center. When that IMAT links up with the state EOC, it forms what we'll call right now, we'll call it the IOF, the Initial Operating Facility, and it contains the state coordinating officer and the federal coordinating officer, which is the very, very baby steps of the UCG, the Unified Coordinating Group. That becomes the state level leadership that makes decisions in this response, right? So the UCG is a very, very key element for initiating the deliberate response. And so FEMA's plan is to launch the IMAT to get out here as fast as possible, link up with the state EOC, and create the UCG. So right here, when the UCG is established, that's the trigger that moves us out of phase 2 alpha and into phase 2 Bravo. Phase 2 Bravo is the employment response. You can think of it as deliberate response, where we now have a state-level entity making decisions, moving this response forward. Right now, we're saying that that could take up to 72 hours because the transportation network is going to be so broken trying to get stuff here, right? Could take up to 72 hours. The planning has that IMAT launching in 12 to 18 hours with the hope of getting here in 24 hours, but might not happen, right? So that's phase 2 Bravo. Phase 2 Bravo is the primary goal in the affected area is now save lives, right? Life-saving, save lives. The secondary goal is to increase the response, right? Make the response more robust. But you got to think it's going from chaos to a deliberate response. It's not instantaneous. It takes time to build that out. So phase 2 Bravo, it's all about life-saving. Now that continues until the UCG makes the determination that life-saving efforts are complete. That could be 10 days. Probably will be much longer than 10 days, though. Could easily be several weeks, especially with aftershocks, throwing the whole area back into a life-saving mode. But whenever the UCG says, okay, life-saving efforts, we've done all we can, now let's move to life sustainment, that's the trigger that takes us from 2 Bravo to 2 Charlie. Right? 2 Charlie is the transition to recovery. So 2 Bravo, we're not sure how long it's going to be, 10 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, we don't know, but somewhere in that window probably. But then phase 2 Charlie is your transition to recovery. So now you're trying to provide some sustained pure water capability, some sustained food, some, trying to increase your road networks, trying to get some kind of a fueling system set up. All of that continues for a while. And 2 Charlie, right now, the best estimates are that that part of phase 2 will be a year long at least, right? A year of response in phase 2. And then at some point, when we transition to long-term recovery, that means that the response has been transitioned to private enterprise and to civil authority. DOD is probably standing down and demobilizing. That's about the time that long-term recovery operations begin and transitions to phase 3. Phase 3, long-term recovery, depending on who you talk to, could easily be, and most likely will be decades long, right? Decades, if not longer. I'm not sure how to measure beyond that. All right, so that's the FEMA phases. So all of our planning is kind of comes down to this slide. The blue is doctrine, basically. Basically, it just talks about trying to get to the release of federal assets. Incident occurs, everyone's overwhelmed, it goes to the governor, he asks for more, it goes to the president, he directs FEMA, establish a joint field office. What we're trying to do in planning is pre-coordinate all of that. And all of that stuff takes time. So what we're trying to say is 5 minutes of shaking, this big red arc, and we're already here. So that's our pre-planning. And everyone seems to be on board with that. That's FEMA's plan, it's our plan, so it's working fairly well. If you're not familiar with the construct of the Joint Field Office, I talked a minute ago about the IOF, the Initial Operating Facility. That is the very baby footprint that eventually grows into the Joint Field Office. So that's the outer blue, all the different agencies that are represented. And then inside, you end up with the Unified Coordinating Group. That's the decision-making group. And the minimum people that have to be in that UCG are the state coordinating officer and the federal coordinating officer. But eventually, you can have the governor's authorized representative, the adjutant general, the defense coordinating officer. You can have a lot of people. All right, not that this is too terribly critical for this audience, but in the title that I briefed a little bit ago, I talked about the dual status commander concept. So what's important to know here is that when you see one of us in uniform, you see me in uniform, and I look just like a couple 100,000 other people that wear the same uniform. If you go down to Joint Base Lewis McChord and walk around, you'll see thousands of people wearing this uniform. And in your mind, we're all the same. But the truth is we are not the same. We are significantly different. And I'm going to try and explain that in as few words as possible right now. I am a soldier under Title 32 of the United States Code. Right? That's the federal law that talks about who I am and what I do. What that means, Title 32 basically says that I work 99.99% of my time, my life cycle, I work for the governor of the state to which I'm assigned. So I work for the governor of the state of Washington. I am an asset for the governor of the state of Washington. I'm active duty military, I'm full-time military, just like anyone you saw at JBLM, but my job says I work for the governor. That 0.001% of the time, I can be mobilized to Title 10 of the United States Code, and I can be employed by the President of the United States. And he's done that a couple times when he sent me off to Iraq and other places unspecified, right? So, most of the time I'm Title 32. You go to JBLM, most of the soldiers you see there that look just like me, they're employed under Title 10 of the United States Code, which means that on a daily basis, they're employed by the President of the state, or by the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense. And so they are a presidential asset. Well, that U.S. Code provides some significant difference for those two entities, right? As an employee of the governor, effectively, I'm a federal employee, but I work for the governor, I have less restrictions on what I can do. So it gives us the ability to do things within the state and under the command and control of the state. And then the Title 10 folks, they don't work for the governor, they work for someone else. Well, to command and control both of those simultaneously requires a very select individual who's got to be highly and specially trained. And we call that individual a dual status commander. That individual is recommended by the governor and approved by the Secretary of Defense. That's the only individual who can command and control soldiers in both statuses simultaneously. For this response, we need soldiers in both statuses simultaneously. So we have to establish a dual status commander here. Now, here in the state of Washington, that dual status commander will work for the Adjutant General, who reports to the governor as the Commander-in-Chief inside the state. But on the Title 10 side, he also has to report back to NORTHCOM, who largely becomes the headquarters that provides a lot of forces to help us. So, a lot more data there on dual status commander than you ever needed to know. All right, so here's what's centric to our planning, what our planning team came up with. Is we started looking at the federal plan, we looked at NORTHCOM's plan at the time, and we started learning all kinds of new acronyms. If you guys have ever heard of the FEMA planning, you're probably familiar with things like BSIs, Base Support Installations, FSAs, Federal Staging Areas, RBCs, Responder Base Camps, and CPODs or CPODs, Community Points of Distribution. Those were all foreign to us. We did know the DoD acronyms, the BSIs, the LSAs, the FOBs, the COBs, the COPS, all of these. Okay. And then we got to learn the state acronyms, SSAs and CPODs. But all of the acronyms to us it was vernacular soup. It was just a bunch of stuff we didn't understand. So what we decided to do to make it easier for everybody was we would just go ahead and create our own acronyms. And I say that in jest, but there's a little bit of truth to it, right? What we did is we identified requirements. And we didn't really care if it was a BSI or an ISB or an FS. We didn't care. We just said, we understand that we need these things. And so we identified that there are 5 tiers of logistical capability that had to exist in this environment. And pretty simply, and we got to it pretty simply. So these first 4 tiers are actually all a level of basing. It's a logistical base. The last tier, tier 5, is actually, if you're familiar with the term CPOD, it's 100% synonymous with a CPOD. It's a community point of distribution. Right? That's a tier 5. But these other 4 are all some kind of basic. And whether it's a FEMA ISB or a DoD BSI or a state SSA, we didn't care. We just know it has to exist. So the way that we got to this, kind of simply, is remember, going back to the damage estimates, the roads are down, the rails down, the ports down, the airports are down. The only thing that existed were some runways. We said, okay, well, it's an in. It's a thing to start with, so let's start there. So we're going to maximize the runways. So what we want to do is we want to identify the biggest airplanes we have, and we want to load them up with as much stuff as they can carry, and we want to bring them in here and get them to work. So, okay, let's take a look at C-5s and 747 freighters, the 2 biggest airframes the U.S. has. All right, we're going to start there. All right, now let's look at those airports. Where can we land C-5s or 747s? And in the state of Washington, that number of airports that can handle those airframes is about 6. Right? We said, oh, okay, well, that's not quite the number we're hoping for, but let's put them on a map. Let's see where they are. And so we did that. We plotted them on a map. We said, okay, that didn't get to the population we needed to get to. So let's continue the thought process and pare it down to get some more airports in there. Let's look at smaller airplanes. Let's look at the C-17 and the C-130. They have about the same footprint. So now we're going to load those up, get them in here, just as many as possible. How many airports do we have that can handle those aircraft? And still not the number we're hoping for, but let's put them on a map. And so we put them on a map and we showed where they were, and still whole segments of the population that weren't getting any attention this way. And so, okay, well, let's continue that thought process. Let's scale down to another aircraft. Let's look at maybe the Shorts 330 and the C-23 Sherpa, and let's see where they can go. And now we looked at airports that can handle those, and now we've got about a couple dozen airports. So we plot them out there. We say, okay, well, that becomes our tier 3s, right? The big ones were tier 1s, the secondaries were tier 2s, now this is the tier 3. But we still weren't getting to all the population groups we needed to get to. We said, okay, well, how do we solve that equation? Now we're kind of running out of airports and airplanes. So we said, okay, well, rotary wing. Now we can use Farmer Joe's field. We just need a big field, but we'll get to the rest of those populations via vertical lift or rotary wing. So let's template where those need to be so we get to the rest of the population. And so we did that. And now at this point, we've got these tier 1s, these tier 2s, these tier 3s, and these tier 4 bases, right? Tier 1, 2, and 3 all are around centric to airfields, and tier 4 are to some large open space. So that's basically, in a nutshell, how we got to this, right? All right, so then we said, well, what do these tiered bases need to do? And they pretty much all need to do the same stuff, it's just their scale that changes. And so we identified what that was. So we put them on a map, we said, okay, where are they? So here's all the airports that we identified as tier 1, 2, and 3. All right. So this slide, in a nutshell, kind of shows the giant high-level overview of what we hope to achieve. What we want to do as soon as possible after the Earth shakes for 5 minutes is we want to jump forward and establish tiered bases as fast as possible and as near simultaneously as possible so that we can begin to distribute support and relief from those tiered bases in general. So how do we do that? Well, first off, your Washington National Guard has some assets east of the Cascades that are expected to survive most of this that we can leverage right away to get things going. Using some assets east of the Cascades, what we're doing right now is we're training and developing these small teams. We're calling them RSOI teams. Stands for Reception, Staging, Onward Movement, and Integration. And what their mission is immediately after the shaking, they come together in Spokane, they get on some helicopters we keep in Spokane, and their job is to launch across the Cascades, launch across the Cascades to those pre-identified airports that are tiered bases, and link up with the airport manager to find out if that runway is still usable, right? That's the very first key task. Can we actually land things here? And surprising, maybe not, if the DoD enterprise is going to go to Orange Land or some other nation and establish an airport, we have people that are fully trained and capable to do that, to go and evaluate whether or not we can land an aircraft here. They can do that in Orange Land or Afghanistan or Iraq. They do not have the authority to do that in the United States, right? We do not have that authority here. And our friends at the FAA will remind us that they own the airspace from 1 inch above the asphalt to the heavens, but they don't own the runways, right? So the only person here in the United States that can tell us whether or not that runway is usable is the owning and responsible airport manager. So what these guys have to do is they have to jump forward, link up with those airport managers, and find out, hey John, is your airport usable? Is your runway usable? Yes or no? And if the answer is yes, then we transmit that data back, and we transmit it to the state EOC, and we transmit it to FEMA, and we transmit it to Northcom, and we transmit it to the National Guard Bureau, and we say, the runway at Port Angeles is usable. Launch mission assignment bundle number 1 for Port Angeles Airport. So what does that mean? That means that in phase 1, we had pre-planned what we think is going to be needed here, and we've identified that asset somewhere else in the nation, And we've created a chart that says, hey, this aircraft, the first aircraft going to Port Angeles is going to carry these things. The second aircraft going to Port Angeles is going to carry these things. The third aircraft going to Port Angeles is going to carry these things. And somewhere across the nation, after 5 minutes of shaking, people are starting to move and pack and load and get ready to move. Right? In the military side, we call that a TIP kit, a time phase force deployment list or model. That's the level of planning we're trying to get to. Okay?
Sir?
So, yes, sir.
Is your team going to be able to stay on site to monitor the runways during aftershocks?
Yes. The intent is, it might not be the same team, but the intent is that this is only a lead element. And as those assets begin to come in, they shell out bases at each of these locations. And that base is absolutely there to do that that with a bunch of other stuff. All right, so that's the establishment, that's opening. And so for us in a military mindset, we might call that theater opening. So what that gets to, of course, is first we get the tier 1 bases. And we have to very early on start thinking about that medical evacuation mission and start moving folks out, potentially through a backhaul method, but non-standard evacuation. We continue that thought process, we establish the tier 2 bases. And this slide shows these tier 2s coming out of eastern Washington, as the airplanes launch out of eastern Washington. And realize that there will be a lot of that. We have to shorten the legs for those airplanes so that we can use them as much as possible. So there'll be a lot of ground assets coming into these from elsewhere across the United States. But these aircraft can also come from anywhere in the United States, direct to where they need to be. And in general, for logistics, we need the logistics to go from as close as possible to point of origin to as close as possible to the point of need with as few stops in between so that we don't waste time and effort and manpower and space, right? So it's a huge logistical challenge, but something we're working through. So that's the tier 2s. We continue that process out to the tier 3s and the tier 4s. And the United States Navy, of course, incorporates, their first assets will be on stage probably around, in location probably 5 to 7 days after the earthquake, and we integrate them into the response. So to do that, we've identified a whole bunch of lines of effort. We call this chart here the worm races slide. It's very, very generalized, but it shows all these different lines of effort we think DoD assets can affect, and then when, over time, they become important. So like search and rescue, very important initially. Over time, it gets thinner and thinner and thinner until it goes away. But engineering starts a little later because that stuff's heavy and hard to move. And then as it starts going, of course, it gets heavier and heavier and heavier until it transitions back to private enterprise and then it goes away, right? So just different lines of effort. If you start going down all these lines of effort, and I won't spend very much time on these slides, but we looked at each one of them to try and figure out exactly how deep we need to go. Here's that immediate response authority, those Title 10 installations, and all we're saying here is please help the local community, and that's where they are. Then we looked at immediate response authority for aviation assets. And we said, hey, what we need to do with those guys is pre-plan their priorities. So, for example, we've got a nice fleet here of Title 10 assets at JBLM. We want those folks to get out to the coast as fast as possible. We've got some Coast Guard up here. We want them to try and do HLS 2. Although, if they're not there after 5 minutes of shaking and a subsequent tsunami, then these folks have the backup mission of doing the whole peninsula. We've got 3 Navy Seahawks up here and some CBP folks on the border. We want them to take the northern counties along with the Suffolk County Sheriff's Department. King County Sheriff's Department will take their county. Over time, as more assets come in, we will have this entire area inundated with military aircraft trying to do search and rescue. But initially, it's going to be a challenge to get those here as well. All right, command control communications. What this slide's really talking about, if you remember going back to the EOCs, 37% have to devolve their authority. What we're trying to do here is bring in communication sets that allow civil authority to reestablish their EOCs. So we're talking about bringing in it's a fairly capable equipment set, our GISCs. Bring them in so you can reestablish comms, but that's not the end result. The end result is, for communications, that will probably bring in civil authority or private enterprise very, very fast, as soon as we can move them. The GISCs don't provide long-term capability at the level we really need for this. All we're trying to do here is get folks back up on the net. All right, here we're talking about deliberate search and rescue ground. At SR 530, you saw the use of a couple of federal USAR teams. Those USAR teams are fantastic assets. They can do some great, wonderful things. You can actually, they've done so much planning on the USAR teams that you can calculate in this environment exactly how many buildings for planning they can clear in a set amount of time. The problem in this environment is when you calculate out how many buildings need to be cleared after this, the requirement is for hundreds of USAR teams, just in Washington State. We would need hundreds of them for the mission. The problem is there are only 28 federal USAR teams in existence. One of them belongs here in Western Washington and is probably not available after this because those individuals all work for some other civil authority if they're not victimized. So you're 28, now you're down to 27. California, who also suffers the CSZ shake in Northern California, has 8 of those USAR teams. They're not going to let them go until they don't need them anymore. So now we're down to 19. Of those remaining 19, we have to split with Oregon. So we're not going to get lots and lots of USAR teams. The ones we get, we have to prioritize where they go based on where they can provide the best amount of support, right? And then the other areas that don't get USAR teams are going to have to make do with non-standard USAR or wide area search. Most of our law enforcers in the room are probably familiar with that as they've got the search and rescue requirements. We have to make do with other methods, and we can augment that. There are also non-federal search and rescue teams across the nation that we'll have to program in. But right now we don't have good visibility on that. So that's the deliberate SAR. Air, and we had the slide earlier that talked the use of some aviation assets. Over time, as this whole thing becomes deliberate, then we'll establish a way to prioritize and mission aircraft to deal with that. Expeditionary medical. So what we're talking about here is military medical, and the intent is to get providers and put them as far forward in the damaged areas as possible so that what they can do is help reduce the medical evacuation requirement. If there's somebody in Grace Harbor County that needs stitches, let's put a provider out there that can provide stitches so that that individual doesn't have to be medically evacuated back. That way we can save space for the folks that must be medically evacuated, trying to reduce some of that load. And the expeditionary medical, of course, feeds the people that do need to be medically evacuated. They feed them back into the medical network of hospitals. But remember, the hospitals took a significant hit. So we bring in federal assets here, the DMATs, the Disaster Management Assistance Teams, that basically medical assets that augment helicopters to help restore capacity. We bring those in to augment the hospitals so that the expeditionary medical feeds this system to try and get folks medically treated. This system then, again, they identify the folks that must be medically evacuated out of the area, and they move them back to the DASIS. The DASIS is a disaster medical staging facility. It's a DoD asset that moves stabilized patients from one hospital system to another. So this begins to move people around the nation to other hospital networks to help people get extended care. All right, mortuary affairs. So mortuary affairs, at the SR 530, you saw the National Guard provide some assistance to the coroner in Snohomish County. That was not a mortuary affairs company. That was a fatality search and recovery team, a small entity. Very, very capable. These mortuary affairs companies are exponentially more capable than necessary. And because the forecast has the majority of the fatalities occurring out here, we'll put mortuary affairs companies out there to augment those county coroners. Every other county will get an FSRT to augment their county coroners. Water purification. Big thing about water purification is DoD does not have enough assets to provide ROPUs and TWIPs, reverse osmosis water purification units, or tactical water purification systems. We don't have enough to provide all the water that's needed for 5.3 million people, plus the people in Oregon. So what we have to do is we have to get smart about this. This is Western Washington. Typically, even in August, people are not going to die from dehydration in Western Washington, right? That's probably not likely going to happen. So what we need to do is provide water filtration capability to individuals if they live near rivers and streams or lakes, some source of fresh water they can filter. So that takes care of a large segment of the population, particularly in the more rural areas. But in the larger metropolitan areas, we need to provide the ability to purify and hand out water. And so we bring in the capability here and put them largely in metropolitan areas. All right, security. So Superstorm Sandy, you saw guard members that were providing food and water to the 10th story of a high-rise condominium. That's these folks. You can, we're labeling them security forces, but you can think of them as manpower. These are manpower for the response. So these are the people that work for the emergency managers to get things done. Engineering, I like to refer to this as the least realistic line of effort because the engineering assets are heavy and hard to move. By the time that they're identified around the nation and positioned so we can get them here, they might well be replaced by private enterprise or state or federal ESFs from elsewhere in the country. So it may not be military assets at all, with the exception potentially of some of our ribbon bridging outfits out there. They may probably get used. Fuel. So we talked a little bit earlier about the difficulties with fuel. Here, we've identified a way to provide some fuel for the response, but there's a couple big caveats in there. Number one, this is fuel for the response, not for the civil population. Number two, this fuel, the only thing that we've got a capability for right now, we're working on other methods, but right now, this is jet fuel. This is Jet A, which is great for a helicopter and a turbine engine. It's okay for your diesel-powered trucks, but it doesn't do anything for your gasoline-powered engines out there. And your diesel-powered trucks, I'd recommend if you plan on using this fuel, that you stockpile some fuel filters. Because as soon as you start running this fuel in your diesel-powered trucks, it's going to clean out your fuel system, and it's going to take all that gunk and put it in your fuel filters. You're going to have to swap out your fuel filters a couple times. All right, but it's a way to get some fuel in here. And then as the road network opens up, we'll need more trucks, so we'll bring more trucks. All right, so we kind of recap what we've seen so far. So we've identified the tiered bases. We've identified these different lines of effort. So what we started to do at this point is we started to put these two together, put them on a map, make sure that it all makes sense. So here's this is a legend that shows all these different items we just talked about. And then here we calculated out, just for the DoD response. Remember, this is not the total response, just the DoD piece. We calculated out by Homeland Security region, based on the high-track study, what we thought the DoD assets would need to be in each Homeland Security region to do those missions. So here we are in Homeland Security Region 2, right? And those right there, the assets we need up here. Homeland Security Region 2 is just short of about 3,000 people. See down here the total, 40,000 people responding to the state of Washington. When I first saw that number, I was a little taken aback. I thought, oh my goodness, that's a big number. Nobody's going to believe us. They're going to think we're crazy. So I started doing a little historical comparison, and what I found out is that the DoD response to the city of New Orleans in Hurricane Katrina was 10,000. 10,000 DoD responders to the city of New Orleans. So 40,000 to the state of Washington turns out to be a fairly efficient response. And, oh, by the way, you have to understand these numbers. It doesn't mean that 40,000 people are going to show up overnight, right? It's going to be a flow that brings them in. And it doesn't mean that you're going to have 40,000 and it's just going to stop right there. You're going to have a constant revolving number of people. 40,000 might be the high water mark. It might go higher. It might top out just below that. Over a year of response, the amount of people that will have rotated through here in response will be in the hundreds of thousands. I have no doubt. Right? So that's just a way to look at it. So we started plotting all this, trying to figure out how this is all going to work. And what we're doing here in the Washington National Guard is we're applying a headquarters to each Homeland Security region to help continue this planning with the emergency managers in that given Homeland Security region. We'll talk more about that here in a moment. Our intent, the intent of the Adjutant General here, is that when we do this, when we apply DoD forces in a Homeland Security region, that, you know, we're military, we'll never give up our chain of command. All those forces must work for, you know, the next person in the military chain of command. But we have a doctrinal relationship that we call, it's direct support. To us that means specific things, but our intention is to put military forces in direct support of incident commanders and emergency managers across the state of Washington. That gives incident commanders and emergency managers direct access to those soldiers and airmen to do the things they need to get done, right? That's our intention in this. All right, so we started plotting all this for the assets. I'll use HLS Region 1 as an example. So you see all the different icons here that talk about the different tiered bases. These are tier 4s, tier 2s, tier 3s, tier 1. And if we knew where stuff needed to go in that region, we plotted it on the map. So for example, here in Bellingham, we're saying that they needed a certain amount of fuel capability. They would need a DMAT to augment their hospital based on forecast loss. They would need some water purification. They would need a signal capability. They would need some medical capability. And all of that was going to be right there in Bellingham. And so if we knew that, then we plotted it on the map. But there's a whole bunch of stuff left that's not plotted out here because we don't know where it goes. We did the math based on the high-track study, but it's up to the emergency managers in that Homeland Security region to tell us where they want it to be. Where does it make sense to go? And so that's more planning that needs to occur, and that's why we're partnering with emergency managers at the county level to continue this level of planning and figure that out. That information to us is critical. We need to know where it's going so that we know what airport it needs to arrive to. Right? So when I say that this airplane is going to Port Angeles, it's because these assets are going into Port Angeles to distribute to these tiered bases. Right? So that's Homeland Security Region 1. Here's Homeland Security Region 2. We did this, of course, for the entire state. So here's the assets yet to be placed here. And now what we're doing in that planning, working with emergency management in each Homeland Security region, is if you disagree with what our planning team came up with, that's fine. That's what we want to know. If you think that we've put too much of one type of asset in there, let us know. We'll take some off. If you think that you need more of another type of asset, let us know. If it can be coordinated, we will include it. Right? We will increase it by that. All right, so again, we've done that for all the Homeland Security regions and Eastern Cascade. All right, so inside the Washington National Guard, this is how we intend to organize. We'll have that dual status commander. He'll have 7 geographical task forces, 1 for each Homeland Security region, Western Washington, and then 1 for the 3 Homeland Security regions, Eastern Washington. We'll have a large aviation task force. We'll have a subverting task force that can do the toxic industrial chemical response, as well as the fatality search and recovery mission. And then initially, the initial operating facility that grows into the Joint Field Office will be located at Camp Murray. So initially, we'll have a garrison command at Camp Murray to deal with that. All right? All right, so the way forward. First off is disseminate the plan. So that's what we're doing right now. I'm out here right now disseminating this plan, letting you all know what the plan is so that we can solicit your feedback through those planning teams at each Homeland Security region and help us make this plan better. So we're disseminating it. The next piece is exercise the plan. In FY15, actually now for 30 days away or so, we're doing an internal, the Washington Military Department, so EMD and the National Guard, are doing an internal rehearsal of this plan. And we've reached out to a few select local jurisdictions, specifically for this exercise. We're calling it Evergreen Tremor. We're working with HLS 3, so Mason County, Grace Harbor, a little bit of Thurston. We're working with Homeland Security Region 6, Seattle and King County, and we're doing just a little bit with Pierce County. We'd probably do a lot more with Pierce County if they didn't have a big golf tournament coming up. But that's our internal rehearsal. We're calling it Evergreen Tremor. So if you hear about Evergreen Tremor, it's us rehearsing pieces of this plan next month. And then next year, June of 16, if you haven't already heard about Cascadia Rising, Cascadia Rising is a massive national level exercise that's occurring here in Washington State to rehearse foundationally this plan, the federal plan, everyone's planning associated with the Cascade Subduction Zone. The Cascadia Rising here in June of 16 is in the DoD world. It's got Ardent Sentry status and Vigilance Guard status. That means it's a Tier 1 DoD enterprise exercise. So it's big. We're also bringing in a lot of Guard folks, so our intent is to do a very high, large-scale rehearsal of our pieces of this. And we hope to do at least a little piece in every Homeland Security region. So for Cascadia Rising, and this might be news to you, Penny, but we're hoping to have some level of play here in Homeland Security Region 1, even if it's just small. I think our big effort in June of next year is going to be Homeland Security Region 3 again, but we want to have some here. So that's exercising the plan. And then last, completing and refining the plan. Out of these exercises, our intent is to take the feedback we received. Have our rehearsals identified problems? Have they identified gaps? Are there things we can fix? Then we will republish our plan. Our plan right now, our internal plan, is published as an initial draft. After the exercise next month, we're going to republish it as a final draft, incorporating those changes. And then after Cascadia Rising, we will publish it as our final contingency plan, incorporating all the latest changes. So that's our way forward. We're also working with FEMA and the regional interagency steering committees to get more of the federal ESF participation in our planning. I talked a little bit today about DMATs and USARs. Those are federal assets. The DMATs are controlled by ESF 8, Health and Human Services, and the USARs are controlled by ESF 9, the Joint Personnel Recovery Center in North Mountain. So we're working with those. This is our timeline for this comm plan. I basically just talked it with you. So here's our exercise next month. Here's the big exercise next year. And then the final plan is published sometime after that. All right, so pending any questions you might have for me, that concludes my briefing. And we're about 15 minutes longer than usual. Yes, sure.
The EOC, the Camp Murray, that was built, I think about 10 or 15 years ago, and in light of what we know about that 9-0, is that survivable?
The current, the sheriff's question was, Building 20, the state EOC, it was built recently with higher earthquake codes. Is it survivable in this environment? And the planning answer is yes, it is. It's built on hinges. The entire foundation is built on hinges. It's built above ground. So the building is survivable. For the 2001 earthquake, they barely felt it. I mean, they moved stuff, but they were fine. So yes, the building is survivable. Talking with the EMD plans guys, however, they're a little concerned about some of the life support pieces that plug into the building, because all their power and everything comes out in tubes, and if the building moves too much, it might shear the tubes. So the building itself is survivable. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the dams on the Columbia River hold back an awful lot of water. If we consider what happens if one of those fails and what's going to happen to Portland, and if that does happen, are they going to divert most of the assets to Portland that would normally be here?
So I can answer a whole bunch of pieces of that. Okay. But the first thing I want to point out is that big assumption about using the high-track study data, right? Our planning training team looked at the high-track study data, and that's what we plan to. So I can't authoritatively answer part of your question. I can tell you I've talked with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and they're pretty confident that the dams in the state of Washington are going to survive. So they're pretty confident about that. I have worked very closely with Oregon as part of our planning team, and I can tell you that they're going through the same iterations we are right now, and they're looking at that major metropolitan area that is Portland to figure out what they can do to make it more resilient. So now I think I've answered at least 3 pieces of that. Now, this is something I don't generally talk about, but you've piqued my interest, so I want to throw this out there. If you've ever been down to Skamania County, Washington, there's a little bridge, a little 2-lane bridge that crosses the Columbia there. They call it the Bridge of the Gods, right? For anyone that's ever seen that bridge, fun bridge, toll bridge, and it costs $1 to go across, nice bridge. That's not the Bridge of the Gods. If you didn't understand this, the Bridge of the Gods actually refers to the land bridge that bridge is now replacing. There used to be a land bridge there. That land bridge was effectively created on January 26th of the year 1700. When there's this massive earthquake, there was a massive landslide, and it severed the Columbia River. And it took almost 100 years for the Columbia River to bore its way through that and do a massive rush back out to the ocean. But that was the Bridge of the Gods. So, interesting little tidbit. Yeah. Any other, yes, sir?
Yeah, I went under some information in regards to inundation. If we are not, or if we were slightly hit by the earthquake in Seattle, it basically hit much harder. Would we be inundated with people evacuating out of Seattle to here?
So that might be, and again, I have to kind of talk my limits with the high-track study. Our planning team is very much focused on this CSZ scenario. I think the scenario you'd be addressing would be more like a Seattle fault scenario, which is another great big possible massive problem. And I don't really know. I mean, you'd have to go back to the city of Seattle and find out what their desires would be. So I don't know the answer to that. Okay.
We can take a couple more questions, then we're going to take a short break. Colonel Braun will resume an informal discussion and take more questions and so forth. If you have friends or associates that you would like to bring, we'll start at 1:15 in the Commissioner's Boardroom, which is in the courthouse. It's room 160 on the main level. So you'll remember those what that is. So if there's a few more, that's fine.
Okay. Any more? Going once? Going twice? I just want to point this one out. Be prepared for anything. Yeah, I know. Especially.
Is that an EMP?
I don't know.